Hi, folks. Today we're going to do something a little different. Rather than boring you with one of my lectures, we're going to hear from the author of the book you're reading for this week, Go Golden, Dillon Cruz. Dillon was a student, a master's student at Lancaster Theological Seminary about 5 or 6 years ago.
I graduated in 2018.
Okay, actually longer than that. Uh, um, and was one of the stellar students in regard to biblical studies and theology. And as you will find out, is very passionate about ecological concerns and matters pertaining to the preservation of the environment. I'm going to let Dillon say a little bit more about his recent vocational endeavors. And here he is.
Okay, hey everybody, this is Dillon Naber Cruz. And yes, as Lee said, I was a student here. I graduated in 2018 in the MA program, and I got here by a very circuitous route. I started off as a fundamentalist a long time ago, and then sort of left the faith, and then kind of meandered my way back. And then the next thing you know, I was in seminary. Uh, Learning to academically deconstruct some of the things that I'd learned in fundamentalism, and also uh, taking my concern for the environment and making it theological, which is what led to me writing my master's thesis, which then turned into the book that y'all have to read, and I'm sorry in advance. um, yeah, so I can't separate the two ideas of concern for the environment from theology, and that's kind of where the book what the book lays out. And I grew up Southern Baptist and Church of Christ, and in those two traditions, care for the earth was not something that was even remotely a concern, uh, theological or politically. And so that didn't make sense to me as somebody who grew up in rural North Texas and spent a lot of time out in the countryside and on farms and in the woods and in creeks and all that kind of thing. And so it never made sense to me that in right-wing Christian circles that the environment just wasn't, if it was talked about at all, it was how can we pillage it in God's name or in the name of capitalism, rather than how can we, as Genesis says, look at it and call it good and have stewardship over it rather than dominion, which I think the idea of dominion over the environment is or environmentally and theologically spurious. So that's kind of where I started. And I studied permaculture in 2007. That's the first time I actually went and took a class on it. And it was one of those sort of seminal epiphany kind of moments, hearing that you could design systems that work with nature and not against it. And ideas like if it kills the environment, if it pollutes the water, if it leaves a forever chemical in the soil, then it shouldn't be manufactured at all. And then I started to see, almost in a Buddhist-like way, connections between anything and everything. And that's why in the book I cover things like farming and health and beauty products and how to take care of your house and politics, which is a really hot topic right now for a variety of reasons, and things like warfare, which also is a hot topic right now because we have a very violent and zealous Department of Defense person running the show. So all of those, I can't now I can't separate theology from permaculture and permaculture from theology and permaculture from politics and permaculture from peace, because I see it as living out the core teachings of Jesus to love your neighbor as yourself, and the golden rule, which he said, which I have always said that the most important part of the golden rule is the first part of the sentence, the in everything that you do. And that trips a lot of people up uh, from a theological perspective when they try to justify certain positions that they hold, whether politically or economically or what have you. So that's kind of where I started at, uh, Lee, and that's how I got to the book, which Lee graciously read as my master's advisor and then encouraged me to get published later.
Could you say something about what permaculture is?
Oh, sure. I mean, since I've thrown the word around multiple times, I guess that would be helpful. Permaculture is a system of ecological and social design. And initially, it was an Australian forester and academic who was walking around in a forest one day and he was looking around and he was like, we could design systems just like this that work, that cycle the nutrients through and don't leave pollution behind. And when he initially started to come up with the concept, he looked at different ecosystems, but he also looked at different indigenous ways of caring for the earth. And he came up with the design permaculture designer's manual. It is a very big, heavy book that that lots of permaculture people have read. And he kind of developed these core ethics and principles alongside, and his name was Bill Mollison, and then one of his students was named David Holmgren, and Holmgren kind of expanded on Mollison's 5 principles, and he turned it into 12, I think that's right, and then 3 core ethics. And I espouse those ethics sort of theologically in a slightly different way than Mollison or Holmgren. And I say creation care because the Bible calls creation good, neighbor care because Jesus says that we should love our neighbor, and future care because Jesus said that we should build the kingdom of God on earth, in my theological opinion. So within those ethics, that ethical framework, it started off as permaculture was a contraction or a compound word of permanent agriculture. And it has since evolved from the 1970s until now into being permanent culture. And that's where you find sometimes permaculture design principles being used in social design as well as ecological and agricultural design. And the idea behind these principles is to work with nature instead of against it, to observe and interact, and then design systems that make sense in the place where the systems are being designed. So, in a place like Lancaster County, it would be taking into account the prevailing weather patterns. Where does the wind typically come from? What's the aspect of the sun at different times of the year for creating microclimates and that kind of thing? What kind of soil do we have? We're very fortunate in Lancaster County to have literally some of the best soil on earth, and yet too many farms in the county are killing that soil with ecologically destructive chemicals in the name of increasing their yields. So you take those patterns and then you take the patterns of the biosphere and as a whole, and then the bioregion in which we're in, which here is the lower Susquehanna River watershed, and the different ways the water flows through the watershed, and you can come up with designs that mimic nature to create cultivated ecosystems, which then can provide food, fuel, fiber to humanity while also sustaining the life of the bioregion. And a bioregion is determined by something like a watershed or geographical features or even culture. So again, using Lancaster County as an example, this is a bioregion shaped by Anabaptist Christianity. So all of those cultural and geographic things go into the design process and creating these cultivated ecosystems that work for humanity and for non-human life, what I've taken to calling our non-human neighbors. So the creepy crawlies, the birds, the fuzzy things and the furry things. And because again, in Genesis, if you read Genesis 1, I prefer to skip the patriarchal one in Genesis 2, but that's another that's another discussion. But in Genesis 1, at every step of the way, God creates and then God calls it good. And that tells me that God wants us to take care of it. Because if God calls it good, who am I to say that it's bad and that it should be destroyed and pillaged for profit? Capitalism doesn't see it as good unless it can turn a forest into toothpicks or, lumber for Home Depot. Uh, but God called him good just because. So that's kind of permaculture in a nutshell. It's a conscious design and maintenance of ecosystemic systems to provide for humanity's needs, as Mollison would have put it.
Taking Lancaster County maybe as a case study, what would be a permaculture critique of what's happening?
Okay, oh yeah, that's a really good question. So Lancaster County is situated in the lower Susquehanna watershed, but also more broadly in the Chesapeake Bay watershed. And the Chesapeake Bay is one of the most valuable natural resources that we have because it's a huge estuary. And an estuary is something called an ecotone, and that's where two different ecosystems meet, and then that creates a whole new system, and this niche creates uh, a profundity of life. So we in Lancaster County is one of the number one agricultural counties east of the Mississippi, productively. But far too much of the agriculture is conventional agriculture. And what I mean by that is that they're using things like herbicides. And the number one herbicide in the world is Roundup, and it has glyphosate in it. They're using a lot of fertilizers, and these fertilizers are kind of like heroin for plants. The more you use, the more the soil dies, and then the more you need to use to keep maintaining the yields. But the problem with that is A, the components to make the fertilizer are all finite resources and mostly based on fossil fuels. And B, it creates nitrogen agricultural runoff that then pollutes the waterways. And that's one of the reasons why the Chesapeake Bay, the people around the Chesapeake Bay and the EPA are suing Lancaster County because of a lot of that agricultural runoff. There's also been far too much deforestation along Lancaster County waterways. And what happens when farmers decide to farm all the way up to the edge of a creek or a river is whether it's livestock getting into the river and creating sediment because they're stirring up all the water, or creating pollution because they're defecating in the water, or whether it's monocropped agriculture that creates the runoff that I just mentioned. And so that creates more pollutants going into more and more Lancaster County waterways. So whether they're smaller watersheds like the Conestoga River or the Little Conestoga or the broader Susquehanna watershed. And so that all flows downstream. This is where that connectivity between that I started to see between everything comes into play, because all that pollution goes downstream, and now the Chesapeake Bay and the Susquehanna are very sick waterways. And that causes problems for both the human and non-human life that are found within those waterways. So a critique would be that we need more regenerative, at a minimum, organic agriculture, and we need more of what are called riparian buffers along waterways. And there are organizations, Trees for Grazers being one of them. Regional is a local environmental nonprofit that works in this realm as well. But if you plant riparian buffers 300 feet from every waterway, you're going to catch a lot of those nutrients that are running off. You're going to prevent erosion and sedimentation of waterways from causing further pollution and clouding the water so that various species of fish or invertebrates can't live there. And it will have a knock-on effect of having more clean water flowing into the Chesapeake. And from another perspective, the non-organic conventional agriculture continues to create problems for the soil ecology. And just up the road in Kutztown is the Rodale Institute, and they have done side-by-side comparisons between organically produced crops and conventionally produced crops for decades now. And what they've shown is that the land that is farmed organically is more resilient than the conventionally cropped lands in terms of being able to withstand heat and drought or excessive rain or anything like that, because the soil is more healthy and therefore more productive. And I think her name is Dr. Elaine Ingram or Ingham. I always get her name right, mixed up. But she's a soil ecologist or a microbiologist, and she studies soil ecology. And she basically says if you get the soil right, you don't need all of those agricultural chemicals, which is not music to the ears of agribusiness companies who make those chemicals. So we need more and more of the farmers to convert if they're producing milk or beef or, other meat products, to convert to grass-fed rotational grazing systems with perhaps silvopasture to create shade and timber and fruits and nuts. Silvopasture just means that you're planting trees in a pasture-based system for livestock, and that creates ecosystem benefits as well as agricultural benefits to the land. And if you're doing conventional, I mean, rather crop systems like corn, soybeans, wheat, what have you, if they're organic, they're going to be more regenerative and sustainable for the soil, but also things like soybeans, genetically modified soybeans have been tested by European universities and shown that they are less nutritious than organically produced or non-GMO soybeans. And one of the most prevalent reasons for genetic modification of commodity crops like corn, wheat, potatoes, rice is to be drenched with Roundup. They're called Roundup ready crops. And those crops are less, at least from a soybean perspective, and I would think that others as well are going to be less nutrient dense than uh, those that are not. So all of those things could be uh, done here, as well as when these reforestation projects or riparian buffers are planted, if they were, it can create more diversity in those woodlands. Because a lot of times what happens if a timber company comes in, they cut everything down, clear cut it, and then they plant it only in what they consider economically viable species, often very fast growing, that do not create an ecosystem. They just create kind of a plantation system. And that's not a healthy environmentally healthy thing to do. So increasing the diversity, increasing the use of regenerative agricultural practices and at a bare minimum organic and not, and I feel like I have to say this because sometimes things that are certified organic are using products that are ecologically not sustainable. So when I say organic, I don't necessarily mean that. I mean truly think productive practices that do not harm the environment. So that's what we could do here in Lancaster County. But we have this ancient river, the Susquehanna River is like 4.5 billion years old, according to geologists. It was flowing when all of the continents were together. And right now it's a very sick river. And the political will throughout the state of Pennsylvania, and probably up in New York where the source is in Cooperstown, New York. So there's two reasons to go to Cooperstown: see the headwaters of the Susquehanna and go to the Baseball Hall of Fame. But the political will to keep that river and clean and to biologically remediate it, the pollution that exists within it, is not typically there because a lot of those areas in which it flows are Republican controlled areas. And they've never met a regulation that they didn't hate. So it's hard, even if there is progressive leadership in other areas, to get politicians on board with taking care of the pollutions that exist within the river. And that includes some of the dams. We use dams for generating electricity, and that creates a host of problems. The Susquehanna used to have an amazing shad run, an amazing Atlantic salmon run every year, and now that has been so diminished because of the presence of these dams that generate electricity, but they cause harm to the environment. So there's a lot of different things that we could critique, and a lot of different things that we can do, that we have the knowledge and the and still have some of the resources to do. And that in permaculture circles, we call that, oh, my brain just went silly, appropriate technology. So in certain aspects, fossil fuels would be considered appropriate technology. If we were using them to create the remaining fossil fuels to create sustainable systems, that would be an appropriate use of technology. But if we're just using them for lots and lots of cars and lots of jets and lots of cruise ships and that kind of thing, or the military, which uses a ridiculous amount of fossil fuels, then that's not an appropriate use of that particular technology. So we have the know-how, we need the political will, and that requires a collective will, which is why I think Christians should be on board with taking care of the environment and not having rapture fever dreams that say, well, God's going to make us a new planet, so it doesn't matter what we do with this one, which is something that a fundamentalist told me on more than one occasion. So
now I'd like to shift from the macro systems, like tidal basins and estuaries, to a more micro focus, like people's lawns
right.
and golf courses.
Yeah.
Anything problematic about lawns?
Well, yeah. If you look at the history of the lawn or the garden like a lawn, it was because of rich people saying, look how rich I am. It was an ostentatious display of their wealth, saying, I have all this land, but I don't need to grow food on it because aren't I so rich and aren't I lucky? And we kind of took that idea here in the United States in particular, where when I did the research for the book, which has been a minute, because I wrote the initial draft in 2017, 18. If I remember correctly, there was enough lawn in the United States to cover the entire state of Texas. And if you think about that for a second, the enormity of Texas, where I grew up, if a fraction of that, say a quarter of that, of all that lawn was converted into organic food production or organic uh, pollinator gardens, for example, how much would we benefit the environment and wherever those cultivated ecosystems were created? And then that would have a knock-on effect of increasing the species, the number of different species of pollinators and things like lightning bugs that we all love so much from our childhood, right? But when we rake the leaves, the lightning bugs don't have a place to inhabit until they pop up again in the spring or summer. And if we grew food, well, that's a good way to build community by sharing your zucchini across the fence, and it also reduces food miles. And the fossil fuel use of taking tomatoes from Florida or kale from California and shipping it across the country for me to eat in Lancaster County, or to have tomatoes in February, which tastes terrible anyway. So we could we could do vastly different things. And if you think about it from like just the 20th century, in the 1940s during the war years, there were victory gardens, and everybody that had a lawn was encouraged for national defense and to support the war effort to grow victory gardens because they needed the other food for the troops in the various theaters of battle and so forth. So it was a patriotic thing to grow your garden. And now our resources are more limited than they were. The United States is constantly been at war with somebody somewhere for decades now. And yet we're not encouraged to do that same kind of thing by converting lawns into food production. But if you turn on the TV, you're going to see a commercial for Roundup, and it's going to tell you to spray the dandelions, which is an amazing plant that should never, ever be sprayed for any reason ever. And they're going to tell you to feed your lawn, feed it with some guy with a Scottish accent because they want to sell fertilizer, which, just like the agricultural fertilizer, runs off into the watershed and pollutes the groundwater and the flowing water, the surface water as well. Golf courses, I used to play golf a long time ago. I was terrible at it, um, but they shouldn't be a thing, especially in places that are arid environments. I worked with some permaculture folks in Hawaii who had moved from California, from San Diego County to Hawaii to start the Hawaii Institute of Pacific Agriculture. I taught a permaculture design course there. And one of the reasons that they moved was they wanted to farm, but the water for agriculture was being diverted to golf courses. So this thing that isn't required, nobody needs golf. It's a fine hobby or whatever, but nobody needs it. We could survive without golf. But they were diverting water from agricultural use so that people with a lot of money could go play golf because it costs a lot of money to play golf. So that's one of those things that I think that we could live without, unless a permaculture designer came in and designed a golf course that worked with nature rather than against it, and then still allowed people to have their, recreational time in a more regenerative, ecologically sustainable way. But I don't think the golf enthusiasts want to hear that.
How about I have a neighbor who is obsessed with having the same kind of grass so that the lawn looks
Right.
uniform. Is that a good idea?
Well, one of the things that we say in permaculture is, and it's the first principle, is to observe and interact with nature. And if you observe and interact with nature, even for a minute, you're going to realize that there's no such thing as a monocrop in nature. So if it's a monocropped lawn, it should be really small and very specifically used. You know, it can be nice to have a little spot to sit and, talk with your friends or let the kids play or whatever. But monocrops don't exist in nature, and they require a lot of inputs to keep them monocropped. So I bought a house in 2022, and the reason I bought the house was because it had a fenced yard. I was more concerned about the yard because I wanted to turn it into something than I was about the specifics of the house. And my neighbors across the alley have a monocropped lawn. I asked them one day when they were trimming their grass and putting it in bags if they used chemicals on it. And they said, yeah, we fertilize, we do all this stuff. And I was like, okay, I was hoping for organic, stuff to make compost with. But I started to plant a variety of pollinator plants, including dandelions, letting them grow because they're one of the most important flowers in the early spring for pollinators because they bloom the earliest. And so bees need them for survival when it's still cold. I was also planting yellow and white clover and comfrey and other things. And some of the characteristics of these particular plants is that they are dispersive. So after a while, my clover was getting into the neighbor's yard. I'm not mad about it. But they apparently were because now they've gone back to putting whatever it is on it and the clover is gone. Meanwhile, my growing area, both inside and outside my fence, is now wildly diverse. I have a profusion of wildflowers and clover that I've mixed together because clover helps to fix nitrogen naturally into the soil, so I don't need to fertilize it in any way. And it also is an important pollinator plant. It's also edible. The flowers are edible. You can throw them in your salad. And then a bunch of other wildflowers. And in the back, I have more wildflowers, but I dug up the lawn and with what's called a broad fork. And then my friend and I shaped those into raised beds in which I grow vegetables. And I've also planted berries, and sometimes I just let the weeds, quote unquote, weeds come up and see what happens. And a lot of times those weeds are also early flowers that are wildflowers. So my backyard looks like a little bit of a jungle, a little bit of a meadow, and then a place where I can go get my kale. And it's so, to me, aesthetically, it's a lot nicer than just looking at a monocropped lawn. If I'm looking at a monocrop of grass, there better be players playing a sport on it in my, for the most part, not necessarily in my house or in the neighborhood. So if you could imagine suburbia covered in organic gardens growing food, small orchards growing fruit and nuts, and pollinator garden spaces, then how much more interesting and community minded would that be than having a monocropped lawn with a little sign that says, "Don't let your dog pee here," or, some old man yelling at the clouds and get off my lawn. Um, it would just be so much more beautiful and Edenic, I think, to have that, because nature doesn't monocrop ever.
What can congregations do, if anything?
Well, for one thing, I think that congregations, ministers and laity alike need to be able to articulate why it's important to their congregants or their fellow members to take care of the only planet that we have that God called good. That's one thing that they could do. They could become more ecologically conscious to think in terms of environmental stewardship as a theological practice and as a way of loving your neighbor. You cannot love your neighbor by polluting the environment that they need to live on, which is why environmental racism is such an important topic. Take the AI data centers. They're often putting those in neighborhoods that are lower income, and often Black people or other people of color live in those neighborhoods, and therefore it's environmental racism. They can also, some churches have a substantial piece of land attached to them. Not all, like inner city churches don't have that, but a lot of suburban churches have a substantial piece of land, and a lot of that is parking lot. And there are different ways that those could be designed to aid not only their congregants, but their neighbors in the broader community around. So again, as with the idea of neighborhoods having more gardens like my house, right? My neighbors probably think, "Oh man, that's the house where the weird guys lives," right? But I also get comments when people drive by about how beautiful it looks. And if churches did that, if they allowed their congregants to have gardens, or if they used permeable uh, parking spaces, that would allow for the water not to just cascade off with a lot of pollutants into the watershed. They could then share the surplus food with food banks, etc. They could grow trees, create spaces for youth groups and children's groups to get their hands dirty, to touch nature, to touch God's creation, and become more in tune with it in ways that we often do not see. Little kids can rattle off top 40 hits, and I can still remember commercial jingles from the 70s and 80s, but they might not be able to identify 5 different plants that grow naturally in their area. And that ecological literacy, I think, is important too. So I think that churches could go, do a lot of different things in their buildings too, say using low flow toilets, uh, generating electricity through solar power, or if it's a windy area, using micro wind turbines to generate some electricity. There's a lot of different things that could be done. And here on campus at LTS is a perfect example of how that could work. There's a significant amount of lawn around here. And fortunately, there's a lot of tree cover as well, but there's still spaces where students could put some garden beds in and grow, a few fresh vegetables to eat in a much cheaper way than having to go to the store. And as I recall, it's expensive to go to school. So, anything that would help the students financially like that would be potentially very welcome. So I think that there are a lot of things to do, but one of the most important things is pastors and other people who preach talking about the environment in a way that says it must be conserved and that this is a theological issue. Um, so when I was taking classes with Lee, I did a directed study on environmental theology, and one of the books that he picked for me was environmental eco theology or evangelical eco theology, which blew my mind that evangelicals were talking about it already. They didn't use permaculture as their frame of reference, but they did use the Bible in a very similar way that I do. And we also read, or I also read Laudato Si by Pope Francis, which calls for the care of our common home. And so it was very heartening to know that in Christian circles that was being talked about 10 years ago, but it still isn't as broad as it should be. If every Southern Baptist congregation in America suddenly started talking about this in a way that said the planet is good and should be protected, and that we should love our neighbors and show that love and show that we're following the golden rule by protecting the planet, then that would be a sea change, I think, because it's typically the conservative people on the fundamentalist slash evangelical end of the spectrum that tend to vote in ways and for policies that are harmful for the environment. And if you look at the Project 2025 document, which I have read much more than I would prefer, I wish it didn't exist, but there is so much in there that is ostensibly, they couch a lot of things in faith-based language, but it's so destructive to the environment as a whole, to the biosphere, and it's pro-extractive industry and pro-capitalism, but it's also pro-harm your neighbor in other ways, in sort of social, culture war ways. And again, if we're looking at the golden rule, I don't think the culture war exists. If we're looking at the love of neighbor, I don't think that the culture war exists. And if we're looking at through that lens as our theological rubric, or as what Greg Carey called the canon within the canon, then we don't look at the planet as something that's, or its people and other species as things that are expendable. We see them as creations of God, and we see them as people, places, and other living beings that deserve to have a reasonable quality of life as they continue to be alive.
Well, thank you, Dillon. Any final words of wisdom?
I would love to hear from students who've read the book and have their thoughts. And I would love to see more eco-theology taught in seminary settings so that when the next generations of theologians and pastors and lay leaders and spiritual directors, all the kinds of people that come to seminaries or Bible schools would already be equipped to be talking about these things in this way.
Would you like to say anything about your podcasts?
Oh, sure. Yeah. So after I wrote Go Golden, I wrote a couple of other books, Theological Musings, Volumes 1 and 2, Collected Essays of a Tattooed Theologian. And that inexplicably landed me on Sirius XM on a weekly spot with John Fugelsang, a comedian and political commentator whose parents were both Catholic, a priest and a nun, who left their vocations, got married, and had a family. And we talk about the culture wars and Christian nationalism and theology, and sometimes permaculture. And then I also have the God Squad podcast with my co-host December Rose, who is a former pastor and now current seminarian at Bright Seminary at Texas Christian University. And we talk a lot about Christian nationalism, and we interview biblical scholars, theologians, etc., and commentate on the current political climate in the United States. So I'm doing that, and you can find me all over social media as the Tattooed Theologian on my Substack and blog and other places. So yeah, I'm using my LTS education in a lot of positive ways.
And you don't mind if folk email you?
Oh, absolutely not. Yeah, Dillon Naber Cruz at gmail.com. No spaces or dashes or anything. And you can find, if you need to know how to spell my name, it's on the cover of the book that you're hopefully reading.
Yeah, and I'll send that email address around.
Yeah, please do.
Yes.
Yeah, and I love to hear from people who've read my work, and if you have questions about permaculture or how to start a garden, I am absolutely happy to share that knowledge with you as much as I can. So,
well, thank you.
Yeah, and thank you again, Dr. Barrett, for having me back.
Oh, my pleasure.